Good. Right. So you guys know brainstorming, right, for your projects, but not now. So coming back to it. Localization of mobile devices, few points. Of course, Android and iOS and so on are available for many reasons that they deal with all of this kind of stuff. And what under the hood basically happens is precisely what you said before, right? We have different resources, different assets and so on for different locales, in a wide sense, that are then collectively loaded, right? Some of them are part of the operating system, for example, or Android is aware about number formats and keyboards and all that stuff, right? So it's Google sponsored in a wider sense. But where you need to provide customized user input, then of course you need to provide it in a form of resources. And that of course it comes back to the idea that you need to have default resources, right? So using the example of strings, for example, how it works in Android is that you have some sort of default locale, and you guys have worked with strings XML already, have you?
I think I've heard things.
Yeah? Everyone is somewhat, yep, good. You are comfortable with this one. Right? So what is it about? Why do we have the strings XML thing?
Is it the consts?
Well, exactly what we've been talking about, so you don't have to change the source code to change the text.
Yeah, right. So basically externalize everything, right? So from button labels to text input to application fields to application name, and so ideally, right? So people sometimes don't use it, but the Android IDE is annoying enough to annoy you with the reflection that actually you should externalize this into a string. Have you seen that notice before? How many of you have followed that advice? Oh, cool. So you just press the button fix and see what happens, right? So, so yeah, but that's precisely the idea, right? So they kind of automate this process to some extent. And then following the idea further, okay, now with this as a default, right? So the value strings is the default fallback for the locale in the device. The idea is then that you can actually have a localized version, of course, as well. And they are in the folder structure, res values, and then dash two-letter ISO code. In this case, EN, for example, for English. You can also have a subcode, for example, if you have a country-specific locale variant. For example, if you have French, there are slightly different variations of French for different regions, right? For France itself, for Algeria, for example, for New Caledonia, and so on, right? So they're also, so you can also deal with those nuances to some extent. But the idea is fundamentally that those strings, those resources, then separated by folder out reasonably automatically. And the idea, when you have a localized string and you don't, or a localized string can't be resolved, it falls back to presenting you the default, right? So just to share the intuition a bit more, I think that's probably a timely idea. Given my lack in confidence that my device actually do what it's supposed to do, let's see if we can just work dry. I have buttons. Right, we have this classical, cool, please fix that something, put it out there, right? So you guys have seen that, and it asks you, okay, what do you want to recall the resource name? What's the value? That's the actual text it shows, right? So which does are you working on doesn't matter so much, and the file name you want to put it into. So okay, let's follow this one. So basically that was a, so you get this warning for all elements of your UI where you haven't dealt with this, right? Here, this kind of should be using add string if you see that. What happens then in text, we did it for button 1 right now. If you haven't seen it before, hang on. For the text. Right, you see the reference here, right? Add string button, right? So that's the pointer to unique identifier as opposed to having it hard-coded as in this case, as it was before. So in this unique identifier, it's resolved using the usual r.string, I believe, if I recall correctly, resource direction, and it will be down here in strings, right? So in strings, you now see the app name, which is standard, that's always provided, and the corresponding string for the button in this particular case. Right, so so that's the default value. That is set up basically now, right? So if you want to internationalize this thing, you have the translations editor. And this thing does only one thing. It basically just manages the folder layout for you and the files. But use the editor. So you can do all what I'm doing here manually later, in principle, by creating your own folder and so on, but it's incredibly painful for a particular reason, which I'll show you. So let's say, purely hypothetical, we're in Norway. So, and now you can see what's happening. So we have, you see that this folder suddenly has been extended. What has happened, in fact, down here, it's abstracted away by the IDE, but fundamentally what it does is actually creates a new subfolder, presumably called value strings -no for Norway, and the conventional strings just as a default input. So the default values for all the keys now are denoted here, right? So we have a key app name, as you recall, and the key button. And they have a value in the default internationalization, but for the Norwegian one, we're of course missing something. So what is the Norwegian term for button?
Knapp.
Knapp, that could work. Like that, right? Oh, no, not that, not like that, sorry. That was like that?
2 keys.
Dual pair, okay. Okay, so that should, right. So that's quite convenient because it basically resolves then suddenly, you know, the inconsistency. So if you introduce more languages, you can imagine how painful it actually gets. Of course, which other language? Yes. So, does anyone speak Afar? No, okay, me neither. So, right, so you can easily then keep track of it. So the translation editor is really, really helpful. And you see how it builds up under the hood, so you can basically explore what happens there manually. So, and if you look at the structure here, it's actually stored in, can you see that? Yes. Values, Norwegian bookmal for the region Norway. So that's how it's structured nowadays. So you have the language and then the region you are supporting. Or similar here for, I forgot the English name. Afar in Ethiopia, exactly. So in the region Ethiopia and so on. So fundamentally, those are all individual files you can manage. It's just that we have this translation editor who deals with this one. And if you point to the reference of the key in your application using the add string or resolving it in the application using, hang on, string dot button. Then you have reference to that button value, right? So in the respective locale. That's roughly the idea here. So okay, just to showcase the idea basically there. So that's how it works. So it has some subfolder structures, different string variants, and it basically just with this translation editor check that everything is consistent. And if you are missing specialized translations for localized translations, it will fall back to the default. So bear that in mind, quite important. This whole idea of default resources also extends to a wider set of resources, as you said, the assets basically, right? So for example, you want to have logos for display on Google Play. The layout is of course required, right? So as expected, animations, if existing, XML resources, you can store, for example, collections in there in XML notations, or raw for raw data, some binary data you need for your game. So that's the kind of stuff that should be considered default if you of course provide those in the first place. You know, for example, animation are not mandatory, right? They're optional for applications anyway. But if you want to localize them, you need to have the default variants as well. That's the idea. Yeah, cool. So relatively straightforward. The whole resolution procedure, sorry, it's a bit messy slide here. But basically the idea is that in this, this resource folder, we have the different qualifiers for different languages, right? So in values, in this case, it would be English as a default string. Note, however, values without language qualification doesn't mean it's English, right? It's just a matter of fact that the devices right now, devices are by default set to English, if you like. But if you have another default set, then this would, of course, point is, you can translate into whatever you want, right? So you're in the end the guy who, or person in one instance, who modifies the strings content anyway. But if you have the language-specific suffix, anytime a locale is activated, it will fall back to using those, right? French, Japanese for the individual regions, Danish, and so on. So that's the idea. Cool. So yes, so Android does not only allow matching by languages or locales, but also in principle by devices. So for example, if you have a default graphic resource that sits in the folder drawable, and you have one specific one that is for particular devices with a particular orientation and density and so on. It will fall back generally. So if it has the option of using multiple ones, and it has the challenge of actually what's picking which resource is the relevant one, right? Is it now the fact that you're working on a QVGA, low density, small screen device in landscape mode, or the fact that you have switched your locale to Norwegian is decisive, and in all cases, or in general, it will fall back to language first. So locale is more decisive than device, right? So it would actually, in this case, pick the Norwegian one. That's the idea. Right, and the other thing is also that you can not only use locales in the sense of isocode, two-letter isocodes, NO, DK, and so on, but also the MCC and NMC, right? So what is that one? NMC and MCC? Sanity checks on slides. Okay, cool. Thanks for your attention. So no, it's actually mobile content. Sorry, yeah. Do you know those things?
It was on the slide.
I was on the slide. Thanks. Yeah. Okay. Thanks. Just checking. So the idea is that if you're a mobile carrier, right, you're not only identified, of course, or in fact, you're not identified by locale of your device or whatever else. You're actually identified by you have a global unique identifier, basically, as a certain operator in a certain country. Let me just briefly show you that whole concept. So I use Wikipedia just to give an overview. Just on an interesting note, it's interesting, in most parts of Europe we actually have a mobile phone coverage of more than 100%. So we actually have an average 1 point-ish devices, so it's quite sensible. But going beyond this, where do we have Norway? There we go. So in Norway we have, it seems like 3 operators, right? So Telenor, Telia, and Ice.net, which I've never heard about. But if you look here, they actually have unique identifiers at the end, MCC, NMC. And this is basically, it's barely legible, but basically it's 5, doesn't really matter actually. Yeah, okay. 5-digit number, yeah, there you go. My laptop is slightly delayed in its response. To uniquely identify that operator, right? From this information, of course, it's, well, now I'm Kosovo, anyway. So it's clear where the operator sits and who the operator actually is. So you can also use this as an identifier for your value. So for example, if you want to customize the application by provider, not necessarily by country or locale, you can do that as well. So suddenly if you're with Telenor, you get a different output as opposed to Telia, for example, right? So if that makes sense, you want to greet customers a certain way. So bear that in mind, this option persists as well. It's not only countries. Yeah. So of course there's a large number of different localization approaches and tutorials. And of course Android is, as usual in life, quite tricky depending on the Android version you're running, because the API for localization has changed quite a bit. So it's a bit annoying there. But fundamentally, how do you access the locale, for example, from within your application? You basically get the context, get resources, get the system configuration, and then the locale. And that should spit out or give you reference to the locale. And that includes things like date format, currency format, language, and so on. And if you get the display name, it actually shows you the name of that locale. Have a look at the structure. It's fairly complex and fairly comprehensive, trying to capture all the different aspects we've been talking about. So some specific localization strategies, or let me show some other examples first, I guess, of how to use, for example, internationalized version of strings. So for example, if you have an example string on the left here, right, in Android, it's basically just an initialized string. And if we have internationalized, as you guessed, how would you access it? Well, you get the resources and then access the string from there with the unique identifier of the key in the string.xml file, right? So this way you redirect the lookup into the locale-specific resource folders as opposed to just using a hard-coded string. And that's the case for all other examples here as well. So it's always about accessing r.string and then the variable of choice. And if you use XML, it's used @string/ and then the key of the variable of choice, right? So that's the way of internationalizing throughout Android, if you want to do that, basically. Coming back to that one, but so from a localization, from a strategy point of view, how do you approach it? Well, you want to think ahead, right? So want to ensure that everything works in all application. Most importantly, have a full set of default resources. That's the main thing. That's actually a safe one, because if you don't develop with internationalization in mind, you always have default resources. So it's one possible pathway, even though the refactoring could be really painful. So I think it's still sensible to even externalize the default resources and then internationalize afterwards. We'll get to that in a bit. Something is also to be in mind, have a flexible layout, right? So because what may be short in one language may be really long in another language. Yeah, so I don't know. So if for example, if you transliterate, I don't know, for example, name entry field, right? So different languages, different culture have different name formats. For example, in Norway we have first name, last name, British as well. Spanish don't really, right? So they actually have a so-called name chain, right? Yes, of course, they are seemingly last names and first names, but one of them, for example, is the last name of the mother, and the other one from the father, and so on. And it all together makes sense. So sometimes this consists of 4 different names that have some sort of parental links. In some other countries, they don't have the concept of first name, last name at all, right? So Malaysia is such a country, for example. They only know name chains, so it's a fixed concept. You can't split it. You would need to randomly choose where you want to actually split first and last name. So this is also kind of a culture-specific characteristic, of course, but it also means that you need to have a much larger name field, right? So you can't just assume your average, usual 20-character input or whatever else, but it will quickly explode if you don't think flexibly there. Yeah, one thing that's to be avoided, don't be too super proactive and create strings for everything you can bear in mind, because you need to maintain them, right? So every key in your strings file is basically needs to be multiplied by a number of supported locales. Bit of a pain, so it's worthwhile perhaps to internationalize, but not localize until later on, right? So so it's the way of dealing with this to some extent. And then there's this whole testing thing, of course. It's Android is a bit of a pain here, so of course we can use testing the emulator, test using the emulator, of course, but with different locales, even the devices that are predominantly used differ. Right? In different countries, there's different preference for brands of Android devices, right? So Samsung is heavy in Europe and in Korea and so on, whereas in China itself, different brands dominate and so on. That may also mean slightly different device dimensions and so on, right? So to be borne in mind. So we have limited opportunity with our emulators right now. Cool. There's a fixed and firm checklist, which I don't necessarily need to walk through on Android regarding this one. It's just a reminder of everything you want to bear in mind. I'll just pick out some that may be quite interesting to bear in mind. Broad themes. Right, error messages is one of them. Remember to translate your error messages, right? So that's one thing people often forget. Especially if you want to deal with exceptions and then pass the error messages up and eventually present them to user, ensure that there's externalized as well, right? So you can actually deal with this. Ensure that you also support the dynamic representation of text. So use format text fields accordingly. For example, if they're meant to output date, don't just leave them as text, so actually format them as date output, so a system can pick up that it actually needs to change the formatting when you change the locale on the device, things like that. Alphabetical sorting, okay. Graphics and layout, we discussed that, right? So if you have a manga, want to have a manga application, you kind of need to take that into account, of course, and for sound files, of course, as well. Sweet. Just some facts. How many countries does Google Play actually serve? Any guesses?
Maybe like 50, 100?
That's a good guess, yeah? Anyone?
Most of them.
Yeah? Most of them is good. Yeah, I like that. So it's 144, but doesn't really matter. So, but it's quite a number of countries that actually support it, right? Of course, many of them share languages, so it's less problematic. But it also, of course, it's a bit of a strategic choice which translations you want to do, right? So it doesn't necessarily, make sense to support all 144. Interesting fact: in pretty much all countries but China, you can pay for the apps. Only in China, if you get access to Google Play in the first place, you can only get the free apps. You can't pay there. Interesting observation. Cool. Well, okay, the marketing bit, of course, that's the least. Well, for a developer point of view, maybe secondary, but it's quite central as well, of course. Figure out whom you're selling to, right? So both in terms of people, but also demographic. Different countries have actually, many countries have actually multiple locales, right? So you need to actually support multiple groups within a given society, right? So in Norway, Node, for example, for Nynorsk and Bookmark, for example. But in other countries, it's more permeated that people actually only exclusively speak their own language, even though in a shared country, right? So it's quite important to bear that in mind. So know that somehow. So SPV is one starting point. Eurostat is another good address to point to. There's a lot of money in localization. If you are a local speaker, you have some linguistic backgrounds, know how people tick, there's actually quite some money to be made there because it's reasonably hard to do really good translation. And that basically comes about from challenges such as, how do you actually basically just transliterate, basically how just to, in the simplest sense, if you have a given terminology and you don't have a word in your own language, how do you actually transliterate this particular term, right? So how do you substitute the other languages' characters for your own characters in a simplistic term? That's even before the actual translation, right, where you put new meaning to the term. So usually you need to have some sort of leveled approach to, okay, is there actually a term existing in my language for this particular term in another language, or do I need to kind of transcribe it and circumlocute the meaning somehow? But apart from this, of course, about challenges such as idioms, right? Things that make sense in other languages, like pulling someone's leg in English doesn't probably make sense directly in Norwegian, right? So and other conventions to be borne in mind. So, and then, of course, different payment patterns. Do you pay per word, per app, and so on? Or are you is the translator participating in the individual localized sales? So if you're translating for Norway, do you get a cut of that app for all Norway sales, for example? It's also one way. But the other thing is also translation costs can be disproportionately high to gain. So if you have a country in which you can anticipate only few sales, a limited sale, translations may not necessarily make sense because people are perhaps too literate, so it's a bit of a pity, but that is simply a marketing decision as well, right? So if you, well, Norway has 5 million people, so it's not small, but what would be a small nation? With an own language, you're right. So, exactly. If you translate into Icelandic, that may be a bit more challenging, right? So, does it even make sense? Does it pay off in the end, right? So, so it's also one of the things that unfortunately should be borne in mind because it costs money doing that whole business, doing the translation. Yeah, please.
Iceland also, a country is very strict with like a lot of words that tend to just be taken from English have their own Icelandic versions, which might make it a bit more work, potentially.
Right. Okay, interesting. Yes, possibly?
Been changed pretty recently. Like it still says officially that's what's happening, but practically nowadays the youth is just using more English words because it's turning out to be quite a bother to get all of the English words into Icelandic.
Yeah. So it's an interesting problem, right? So that's literally a transcription of how do you transcribe one word with a given meaning into a different language where you need to adapt the representation to have the same meaning, right? So it's not just a transliteration of syntax, but actually semantic. Interesting challenge, right? So cool. So that could be a possible pathway there. Then challenges. One thing that is not reflected in many of those discussions, which I find, of course, you want to have native speakers that understand the languages, norms, and you have mixed teams of age groups and gender distribution. Yeah, please.
Another thing is that different languages have different structures. Like you could expect them to just have the same structure, but they don't. There are entire languages, probably a group of languages, that where in every sentence, if you're coming with a fact, you actually have to specify how reliable the source of that fact is, for example. And that's just one example. When you're translating, as you said, you probably need someone native speaking, simply because some languages are so different from the ones we know that it's a real challenge to actually translate to it.
Exactly. So it's yeah, your knowledge of a language is super important, and yes, I agree. One other thing that is, I think, super important, which is not reflected here, is context. And when I mean context, is what you're translating for. So in probably 12 years ago or something, I was working for a printer producer, manufacturer company. So my task was to localize a driver. So you get the driver, all in English, I hope it was, if I recall correctly, and I need to translate it. But if you actually don't see the device and how the display interacts with the user, it's really hard to get the translation right? So okay, things like your printer cartridge is empty is quite straightforward, right? But if it tells you open a lever or open a lid or whatever else, it's highly contextualized for how it's called in a different language. If it's, you know, a slightly different, you know, so even though in English it's all the same, in different languages maybe slightly different depending on how it looks like, how it feels, how it works, whether it's to the left or to the right of the display, and things like this. So, and this also needs to be appreciated as well. You need to see the app in order to do the translation appropriately as well. Context is key. Because else you get, I mean, have you guys ever dealt with a really cryptically translated, you know, graphics driver, printer driver, or something like that really looked, you know, you would have asked yourself, how can you with a sane mind come up with that translation for that particular term? And that is basically an artifact of decontextualization. The person didn't know what they're actually translating for properly. So, another issue, for example, I was working with Richard, who's developing games for Android as well, and I did some translation for him. And also, hey guys, I told him, show me at least screenshots so I know what I'm translating for, because it's incredibly hard otherwise to translate dialogue if you don't know how which people interact, in which order, and so on. So it's sometimes really, really hard to do that without the necessary context. I think that's a bit dismissed and should be discussed more as well, instead of just focusing on the cultural specific as well, because that's true for any sort of context anyway. Okay. Good. I think that was pretty much it, what I wanted to say. Avoid string concatenation, of course, a nightmare, right? So you have part of the string that is, for example, in English, and you have some localized string in Norwegian and so on. If you concatenate that, yeah, good luck. So point is, you need to internationalize the whole thing, right? The entire string, and substitute the components accordingly. Keep the layout flexible. I mentioned that before, and don't forget about the numbers. We talked about this. There's some more good pointers here on this link that I found there. So really nice gotchas in there, worthwhile looking into if you're interested. And yeah, if you want, try out some internationalization on your app. It can be a bit of a pain. Point is, it's unfortunately highly dependent on the Android API. So it's a bit of a pain. I was playing around with this, and Android 7 has introduced some changes. A lot of talk from my side. Any questions? Who will never touch internationalization? Good. Do you know the difference between internationalization and localization? Okay, what is it?
So localization is like customizing it for the local area.
Yeah, what's internationalization?
It's kind of like abstracting like sort of a common representation.
Yeah. So is that somewhat clear for everyone and how that works? Right, so basically externalizing string, developing your default values and so on, that's internationalization. Introducing translations, let's say for Norwegian, French, or AFA, is localization. Yeah, so just exam question, hint. Any other thoughts?
There's no translation. There's some people who just like let communities translate for free in a way. So
For free?
Yeah, well, so they sort of like, there's a book about reverse engineering I found, and he's like, if you want to translate it your own language, like go ahead.
Yeah.
So it has been translated to like Japanese. I think the language is speak in Iran. I just can't remember the name of the language. So like
Farsi.
People, yeah, Farsi. Yeah, people that like on their own free time translate to this.
Right. Yeah, okay, that is more like a community project in a wider sense. But when I'm thinking about translation, I'm meaning here's my app, please translate it for me, right? So there's serious money in there, right? And there's also quite this app Blanca, I looked briefly. They actually do rely on machine learning, so they try to automate translation. I would be interested to see the outcomes. I doubt that you can just take it as it, it comes.
We have to feed that thing a lot of contextual information, and then the algorithm would prioritize the wrong thing at some point, and then suddenly everything went wrong.
Yeah, exactly.
There are some machine translated games, and when you play them, it just doesn't make sense sometimes.
Right. Yeah.
Dialogue is just
especially if it's dialogues, of course, right? So with simple menus, then I could think that it could work. Please.
I mean, to be fair, it's still better to play a horribly machine-translated game than to play a game in an actual language you don't understand.
That's fair.
Yeah, if you, the aspect you don't understand is convincing. I agree. Yeah, probably you're right. Yes. So you can make something out of it.
Or if you can't even read the writing, like if it's
then you're screwed. Yes, that's over, right? So you can't apply usual guessing games anymore. Then you're totally on your own. Okay, cool. Well, thank you very much for your patience, particular, and see you tomorrow.
Yes.